According to Census 2016, the level of education completed by disabled people was substantially lower than that of non-disabled people. It reports that 13.7% of disabled persons aged 15 to 50 had completed no higher than primary level education, compared with 4.2% of the general population. So, as you can see from this statistic, many barriers in relation to inclusivity still remain within the education system for persons with disabilities. Children with additional educational needs must be assisted to enable them to progress through and leave school with the skills necessary to participate in an inclusive way in the social and economic activities of society and live independent and fulfilled lives. The Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs, or EPSEN Act, was passed in 2004 with the aim of ensuring that children with additional educational need could be educated in an inclusive setting, and that all children would have the right to be educated in a mainstream school unless it would not be in the best interest of the child or the effective provision of education for other children in mainstream education. Unfortunately, almost 19 years after the Act has been passed, several of the main sections of the Act that would have benefited children with additional educational needs have yet to be commenced. One such section which has not been commenced is the provision of individual education plans, or IEPs. An IEP is considered best practice internationally. Along with appropriate assessments and supports, IEPs are crucial in realising meaningful inclusion of children with additional educational needs in school. An IEP is a written document prepared for a named student which specifies the learning goals that are to be achieved by the student over a set period of time, as well as the teaching strategies and the resources and the supports necessary to achieve those goals. This should be prepared by the school in consultation with the student, if possible, and with the parents and other stakeholders, such as a therapist the student may be attending. As a consequence of this and other sections of the Act not being implemented, children's rights are at the whim of policymakers, of changes in government, funding priorities and other factors. And parents of children can often find themselves lost in the system with little leverage and limited, if any, redress when the needs of their children are not met. This stands in direct contradiction of Article 24 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which the government signed up to in 2018. Within which it states that states parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability. The level of inclusion outlined in Article 24 of the UNCRPD cannot even begin to be reached if the basic structures and execution for IEPs is not available as a standard in schools. While it is the case currently that many teachers do prepare IEPs for their students, and the NCSE have guidelines in place on how to prepare a plan, this is not compulsory and they are not inspected, and therefore the quality of such plans vary significantly, and many schools do not provide IEPs at all. The ineffectiveness of the current model of SEN provision and the lack of a standard individual assessment plan and supports for children with additional educational need in school is also sustaining the lack of mainstream placement as a first option. This compounds the situation and results in parents and children having to travel significantly without transport supports, dependence on reduced timetabling, exclusion and home tuition, over-concentration of pupils with disabilities in schools designated as disadvantaged, and an incoherent approach to reasonable accommodation in exams, and the absence of a transition approach where children are offered mainstream primary class but none in post-primary. Children with SEN that are segregated throughout primary and post-primary have no meaningful access to the local school, continue on a segregated path to day services, with a lack of further education and employment opportunities. And this leads to a lack of quality of life outcome for these children. In his recent report on the lack of availability of school places, the Ombudsman for Children wrote, "All decisions made and actions taken from this time forth should be about building a strong, inclusive education system which is fully supportive of all our children equally. The steps we take now have to build towards that vision." This bill, which I introduced in 2021 along with my party colleagues Deputy Johnny Girk and Donegal O'Leary, concentrates on individual education plans and seeks to amend the Education Act of 1998 to grant additional functions to the Inspectorate to examine and report to the Minister for Education on the prevalence and standard of individual education plans for children with special educational needs on an annual basis. The non-implementation of IEPs has severely impacted disabled people, as evidenced in research undertaken by AHEAD into the transition of blind and visually impaired students to third-level education. And this research identified the lack of IEP provision as the most significant challenge to ensuring appropriate access to supports and resources for students at post-primary level. This research affirms what is identified in Census 2016, that only 37% of disabled people aged 15 to 50 were educated to third level, compared with 53.4% of non-disabled people. So the EPSN Act came into law in July 2004. With its signing into law came great hope for children with additional educational needs and their families. It contained many useful provisions, but the reality is that in 2023 we are still waiting for the Act to be fully implemented. For years now, advocacy groups have been calling for a review of the EPSN Act, which enshrines certain educational protections for children with additional educational needs into law. The review is now underway, and this ultimately must ensure that the Act is fit for purpose, aligns with education and disability policy development since the Act was first introduced in 2004. This should have been conducted, in my opinion, and that of many DPOs, in conjunction with a review of the Disability Act of 2005, to also bring it into line with policy development since it was enacted, while safeguarding the rights enshrined within it to an assessment of need. However, we have no idea how long this review will take, and in the meantime, it is essential that we put procedures in place that will assist disabled people in their journey through the education system and enable them to progress with the skills necessary to participate in an inclusive way in the social and economic activities of society and live independent and fulfilled lives. With that in mind, I urge you to support the passage of this bill today.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank Deputy Tully and Deputy Girk for raising issues relating to the prevalence and quality assurance of individual education plans for students with special education needs in primary and indeed in post-primary schools. It is an important issue which I think warrants detailed consideration, not just in this forum but in the wider education sphere with a range and the full range of education stakeholders. And for that reason and for others for which I will provide detail presently, I will be seeking a timed amendment of 12 months to this bill to facilitate the progression of a number of significant developments in special education which are relevant to how schools and teachers prepare and review the effectiveness of plans for individual students. And deputies will be aware that the aim of the government is to ensure that every child with additional needs receives an appropriate education based on their needs. And my department is committed to delivering an education system that is of the highest quality and where every child and young person feels valued and is actively supported and nurtured to reach their full potential. Special education is a priority area for investment for this government, and this year we will expand it by 27% of the department's budget on special education. So from the outset, I want to state that I recognise the critical importance of effective planning for all students, but most especially for those with special educational needs. Effective planning on the part of teachers will ensure that the right supports are delivered at the right time for students in schools. Effective planning is a collaborative effort which involves class and subject teachers as well as special education teachers. And critically, effective planning practices in schools will place the student at the centre of deliberations and will offer an opportunity to them and to their parents to be active participants in the planning process. And from my own personal engagement with schools, I know that they really value the voice of the students and, of course, that of parents. I am supportive of measures that are designed to ensure that schools' practices in that regard are optimal, and I am cognizant of the need to ensure that data and information relating to students in schools can be used as appropriate to inform policy development in special education and, of course, in education more broadly. Just in relation to the inspectors, the private member's bill before us today proposes to amend the Education Act to grant additional functions to my department's inspectorate, and these additional functions include examining and reporting to the Minister on the prevalence and standard of IEPs for children with special education needs. The proposed bill envisages that the inspectorate would undertake quality assurance of individual education plans for many thousands of students. and among its key responsibilities, the Department's Inspectorate works to provide assurances of quality of school self-evaluation processes. So in that regard, inspection focuses on whole school processes, on operations and planning, and it is not intended to focus on the work of the individual teacher or on the progress the individual student is making in his or her learning. But it should be noted that many inspection models, including those focused specifically on the quality of provision for children with special education needs, involve reviews of plans for students and the manner in which schools seek to implement measures aimed at addressing identified needs. So this involves inquiring into, for example, whether the school is gathering appropriate data on the student and whether teachers are selecting appropriate interventions to meet the identified needs of the student. So during school inspections, inspectors also evaluate the extent to which plans inform the manner in which teachers seek to address identified student needs. So as well as inspection function, the Inspectorate works to support best practice in schools by providing advice and guidance to school management and teachers in respect of whole school planning and planning for individual students. Schools also have the option of requesting support from the Inspectorate in relation to specific areas of their practices, including planning. So it is important to note, therefore, that the Inspectorate conducts comprehensive programme of inspections of special education at primary and post-primary levels, and an analysis of inspection findings shows that generally the quality of planning for individual students is good. Schools have been supported to adopt and utilise a robust self-evaluation process to review the quality of provision for students. But day-to-day responsibility for this work lies with the school principal, who reports on this to the Board of Management. Ultimately, boards of management are responsible for ensuring that teachers avail of the necessary training, supports and resources to allow them to prepare quality plans for students. So deputies may also be aware that considerable training, supports and resources are in place to enable teachers to prepare high-quality plans for individual students, including those with special education needs. And these include comprehensive guidelines and teacher professional learning opportunities provided by the NCSE on planning for students with SEN, comprehensive guidelines and teacher professional learning opportunities provided by the PDST on whole school and individual teacher planning practices. There's also the school self-evaluation support visits provided by the Department's Inspectorate. There's also support and advice on planning for individual students provided by the National Council for the National Education Psychological Service. And there's also a comprehensive suite of published guidelines for teachers on provision in special education. There are also a number of very important contextual issues relevant to the substance of this bill and to special education which need to be considered. And prime among these is the comprehensive and ongoing review of the EPSON Act, which I announced in 2021 and which you have acknowledged in your contribution. EPSON provides for the education of children aged under 18 years with special education needs. And obviously the purpose of the review is to ensure that the legislation on education for students with SEN is up to date, is fully operational and reflective of the experiences of students and families. And critically, in the context of the proposed private members' bill, this includes those sections of the Act relating to individual education plans. Open collaboration and consultation are at the heart of this review, and all stakeholders are being invited to engage with the process. I have obviously set up a number of steps with the Department in relation to the review of this important legislation. We have a steering group, a working group and an advisory group have all been established, and all of the groups have had multiple engagements. Significant work was undertaken during the summer months in 2022 to prepare public surveys and consultation paper as well to inform members of the public of the review. And this online public consultation phase was launched by the Department on the 30th of November 2022. And as of the 1st of March, we've had over 18,000 replies which have already been received. And that survey has been extended and remains open until the 24th of March. After that, we will have focus groups that will be organised at the conclusion of the public survey to explore key themes that arise as a result of the survey analysis, and that review is due to be completed, which I think was one of your questions, by the last quarter in 2023. So given the importance of the review and its current stage of development, it would not be appropriate to progress the private members' bill while this review is currently being undertaken. Another important contextual factor in considering this bill is the recently announced expansion of the National Council for Special Education. I was delighted to have secured, as part of the budgetary process for 2023, additional investment of nearly 13 million to support that. And that will see an increase of over 50% in staffing levels in the NCSE, providing for an additional 161 staff. And that includes additional CNOs who obviously have the day-to-day engagement with schools. So as I outlined at the outset, there is merit in having system-level information and data in respect of all aspects of special education provision as a means of informing special education policy development. And included in this data and information is the number of students availing of additional supports in schools. The introduction of the SET model in 2017 removed the need for a diagnosis of disability. And fundamentally, the SET model acknowledges that schools and teachers know their students best, that they are best placed to determine which students require additional support at any given time, and that they are also best placed to monitor the effectiveness of measures put in place. And this is a fairer, more equitable way of working, and schools have been really good in applying what, in my view, is the key principle which underpins the allocation model, that which states that the child with the greatest level of need should get the greatest level of support. As part of the introduction of the SET model, which recognises that schools and teachers know their students best, the Department also requires schools to have student support plans for children with SEN, and these plans are intended to enable the school to track the student's pathway through the continuum of support and to allow the school to document the student's progress over time. And critically, the student support plan assists the school to provide an appropriate level of support to the student in line with their ability and need. And typically, the plan will document the student's needs and abilities as identified by the teachers, the targets for improvement which have been set as well as the measures being implemented to achieve those targets. The student support plan, it is a living document which is updated as the needs of the child changes and is an agreed and shared document with parents so that everyone is working towards the same common educational goals for the child. And I know from my engagement with schools that these plans are an integral part of how schools support children with SEN. Mindful, however, of the need to have greater levels of data and information regarding the prevalence of such plans for individual students, I will be requesting the NCSE to examine how schools might be supported to provide aggregated data as to the number of students being supported in schools. So, as I referenced earlier, schools have access to a considerable number of guidelines and resources to assist them in improving their provision, both generally and in the area of special education. But I am conscious that we can always improve our own work as well. And I do want schools to be well supported in their work to plan for individual students in particular, because we need to get it right for these. These are our most vulnerable students. And I'll be asking my officials to consider how schools can be supported through the development of a quality assurance framework, which will help to promote excellent practice in the preparation of plans for individual students and indeed support the schools and teachers and parents to collaborate on the optimal education and care responses appropriate to each child's individual needs. You mentioned, I think, about the UNCRPD as well, and we're currently considering the NCSE policy advice on special education provision, and we're aware that the policy advice touches on many aspects of our school system. So we will be consulting extensively with education stakeholders in addressing how we implement the recommendations which are contained in the report. But to conclude, I just want to say I support the intentions which underpin this bill, Chair. I've acknowledged that it is both important and necessary to have system-level data and information relating to the prevalence of individual education plans in schools. And it's also important to ensure that schools' work in this area is of a high standard. So, as I've outlined, there are a number of significant developments that are either in progress or planned, which I believe will address both the prevalence and quality issues that are raised in this bill. However, these will require time in order to progress, and for that reason I will be seeking a timed amendment. So I just want to thank the deputies for raising these important matters, and I look forward to the debate.